Welcome to the Idea Land podcast, hosted by Ravi Reddy. Dr. Sean Casey is an astrophysicist, veteran NASA scientist, and co-founder and managing director of the Silicon Valley Space Center, a business accelerator for new space entrepreneurs. As a mentor and investor, Dr. Casey has supported early-stage startups in the growing commercial spaceflight industry.
I think we're live, so good to see you.
Okay. Hey, thanks, Ravi. Well, I think I'm still dealing with the big COVID shutdown in California.
Yeah, that's a scary thing. You know, one of these questions was, why are we going to Mars and stuff? But I think we have enough reasons to leave the planet,
well,
right?
That's a pretty tough road to hoe. I mean, there's a lot involved in settling anywhere else, much less settling on another planet, which is not quite as hospitable as this one.
Yeah, I agree, and I really wanted to get into that too and get your opinion on that. But you know, you always seem to have the pulse when it comes to space flight, commercial space particularly, but you're at the intersection of the science, the innovation, and the commercial aspect. So just so everybody who's listening just an idea, can you give us just a bit of background?
Well, thanks. Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ravi. You know, number one, I started my career off as a research scientist, doing my Ph.D. at the University of Chicago, and then spent 20 plus years at NASA, both NASA Goddard and NASA Ames, working on various astrophysics projects. Most recently, the NASA SOFIA program, which was in the news a little while ago for the detection of water and some of its isotopes on the moon. Over the last decade, I've been here in Silicon Valley working with a variety of early stage space companies. And prior to leaving NASA, I got my MBA at the Berkeley Columbia executive program. So in some sense, I have a combination. I come from both the research side and the business side here. Bit of a transition going from NASA to commercial space. But I think we had met probably 10 years ago at one of the early Virgin Galactic workshops where they were talking about building a suborbital vehicle to do research flights. And, you know, Sir Richard Branson was focused on commercial aspects of that, but a number of people are saying this will be a good research opportunity, much like the SOFIA program, stratospheric observations on SOFIA and mesospheric observations on suborbital vehicles. And microgravity environments, you know, is an important first step to building experiments that would function in LEO and beyond.
Yeah, and just going back a little bit there, what I think is interesting, because we met in 2009, which just seems like forever ago.
It sure does.
Right, in 2009. And I remember because we were sitting next to each other at that workshop, and they were talking about manned space flight and commercial space flight, commercial tourism, I think in particular, and how to track people's health. And one of the NASA guys or something had brought out, it looked like a suitcase from a 1970s Samsonite commercial, you know, full of equipment. And he's like, this is what we use to monitor astronauts. And I'm sitting there thinking, what the heck is that? Like, we have such, you know, much better stuff, right? And I think that's what really sparked the conversation. But you've made this transition from what I would call big science into commercial. But can we just talk about the big science? Because just some amazing stuff that you worked on. What was it like when you were going through astrophysics at University of Chicago back then? I mean, where was the world when it came to astrophysics and science funding in general?
We still get a lot of funding from the NSF and NASA. Astrophysics at the time was mostly a lot of small collaborations. At Chicago, you could always point to the particle physics groups, where, you know, you would see a paper in, you know, the physics journals that would have, you know, 100 plus authors. And a lot of the astrophysics projects really were not of that magnitude. But today, you know, over the last 30 years, we've seen the birth of, well, you know, let's say just big science, and whether that's people that are collaborating on ground-based facilities or some of the work that was done on the Hubble, you know, for instance, the Hubble Deep Field image
Right.
was really came from directors' discretionary time, but the number of people that participate in a program like that is enormous. So I think what we've seen in astrophysics is a shift from small colloquial projects to something which is enormous, akin to what you see in the physics community and perhaps even in the bio community when you're talking about gene sequencing, the number of people that are involved. Of course, during that time, we've seen the rise of the internet, which has facilitated multi-university and multinational collaborations. And all the communication infrastructure, whether it's email or video conferencing, that has allowed a widely a disparate group of researchers to come together in order to address individual scientific projects.
Yeah, that's definitely been the story in big biology, in science. I mean, I'm looking at a box on the desk right here in front of me that says 23andMe on it. And if you told me that you get genomic sequencing through Amazon, I'd just be like, what are you talking about, right? 15 years ago. The amount of work it takes to get to that level of commercialization is kind of part of the space story, right? So just to give people an idea, you mentioned like Hubble Deep Field, which is, if you, for the people listening who've never seen that image, if you want to reach a spiritual connection with the universe, I mean, go check out the Hubble Ultra Deep Field and the Deep Field image, right? That story behind that it's director's discretionary time, people just doing curiosity-based science, right? Let's go point a telescope in the sky and see what's there.
Yeah, I think there's hypothesis-based research, and then there's sort of discovery science, which is most of the science proposals are based on a chain of evidence that says, here's the reasons why we should go do this.
Yeah.
And, you can say that there's sort of not enough time, out of the peer review process that's dedicated to, I wonder what would happen if we do this. I wonder what we're going to find. But, part of that is just the research dollars that are available. And you can always allocate a certain amount of time with a facility to what is called director's discretionary time. And director's discretionary time is that you don't have to go through the peer review process. The observatory director says, here's what we're going to go do. And they go do that. And that's kind of for, discovery science.
Do you think, just as an aside, do you think that we need more of that in science? Director's discretionary time type of freedoms where you don't have to go through the bureaucratic red tape?
I don't know. I mean, I think these days, I want to say the scientific process, but not the scientific process that's understood out of the Enlightenment, but the scientific process. But how do you manage these facilities? There are kind of some rules of thumb that are out there. And it's probably, somewhere in the 90-10, 80-20 rule. Thereabouts. But, overall, I would say it's not necessarily the discretionary time, but you might say the allocation of federal research. If you look at some place like the Keck telescope, where the UCLA team, Andrea Getz down at UCLA, is sharing the Nobel Prize with Reinhard Genzel for the discovery of the supermassive black hole. Reinhard Genzel's at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. They're sharing the Nobel Prize with the two of them with Roger Penrose, but their work on the galactic center and the supermassive black hole. If you follow what's been happening on the Keck, how much money does the Keck really get? And compared to a number of other programs where the federal government spends its money, and what it's producing is Nobel quality, Nobel laureates, and Nobel quality science out of this. And so are those programs underfunded? A program like SOFIA was constantly battling for funding given all the other programs, but I would say the NASA science program is just fundamentally underfunded compared to all the other things that we do.
Yeah, what's funny is my new yardstick now for payment and for funding is Marvel movie budgets. So it's like when you're making movies about space and, fake superheroes in space and they start costing $300 million. And I'm like, well, we can go to space, and launch things into space and explore space for like similar amounts of money that the revenues are coming back on these movies, like over $1 billion. I mean,
I think it's easy to understand the ROI in terms of dollars, but it's hard to understand the ROI in terms of Nobel Prizes What is the ROI to the country for Nobel quality research? What is the ROI for the United States having a leadership position in science? And which fields are you going to pick? As we exit the 20th century, we're going from a position where the United States was a leader in many fields to where perhaps it's ceding leadership to the rest of the world. And are you doing that intentionally, or is that an unintentional consequence of your physical policies? Hopefully you're doing it intentionally, because if you're doing things unintentionally, that means you're not really paying attention to what's happening.
You're not planning. Yeah, that's right. And there's an interesting question to be asked here, which is, if you were a 19-year-old again in the United States, or actually, no, let's say it's someplace like Malaysia or India, and you wanted to go into space, where would you go? Right? And would you go to Europe, the United States, or if you were 19 in China, would you just stay in China? Right? What's a better place to be part of the scientific process?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the interesting aspects about what what you and I call NewSpace is certainly there's the entrance of entrepreneurs into this sector. And what does it take to be an entrepreneur? It takes 50, 100 million, $200 million to build a company, that's focused on space objectives. How many countries have that level of resources where they could say, hey, we want to be part of the space business, and not necessarily part of the space business, meaning, oh, we're going to partner with NASA, but what are we going to do individually as a country? Many times I give talks about what's happening in the U.S., and you could say that space is being pushed from the federal level down to the state level. What California, Texas, Florida, New York doing about space? You've got Kentucky space, and you can even have space efforts out of Vermont. I mean, there was an announcement for a group out of Maine that's launching one of their first sounding rockets. But in the U.S., you can rank states in terms of GDP. You can compare that GDP ranking, around the globe. And I think we've seen Mexico develop their own space agency, or Australia just came out with their space agency. Israel did out of the Google Lunar X Prize, did a lunar lander. They're going to go back. They're going to redo their lunar program and focus on going to the moon. And I think there are many countries around the world that can say, hey, we want to get into the space business, whether it's doing small satellites or something larger. There are a whole bunch of different price points. And companies like Bigelow were focused on, hey, we're going to build a microgravity habitat in Leo. Would your country, whether it's UAE or some other group, want to fund a laboratory? UAE's done a successful mission to Mars.
I'm just trying to think of this whole thing from, and by LEO you mean low Earth orbit.
Low Earth orbit, yes, right.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just trying to think of this from the perspective of the average American middle class person, right? And I'm trying to think of what their perspective of space in general. In your mind, what do we have to make sure that those people know what space is? Because I feel like there's a lot of old imagery, right, in this. Space shuttles, big government-funded programs, exploration, Hubble Space Telescopes. But besides Apollo and everything that came from NASA, new space is new in terms of some of the people and projects, but commercial space has come in step with NASA from the beginning. Isn't that right?
Well, yes. I mean, that's it's the government that allows you to operate in space, much like the government allows you to do almost anything, right? People want to say, oh, there's no role for government. Well, anybody that's had to deal with intellectual property and the laws that protect intellectual property know that government is required for the successful functioning of a capitalist system. There is no laissez-faire without government, because government provides the rules and regulations. If you stop somewhere and you've blown through a stoplight, that stoplight is there to help the flow of traffic and to protect other people, people that are crossing the street, for instance, from getting in a car. Those are examples of federal regulation. So it's the governments that we live with that structure, what you can and cannot do. You can't broadcast at any arbitrary frequency that you want. You have to, you have to clear that with the FCC. You can't just take your drone and fly it wherever you want. You've got to clear that with the FAA. So there are government structures that protect third parties, and if you don't protect third parties, you can't insure payloads. You can't, the insurance markets don't function, and general commerce, not in the 20th century, but commerce dating back to the Middle Ages, succeeds because there are protections.
So who are the, if I'm using the word IBM in the nicest way possible, but I mean, who are the IBM players in what we would call commercial space that people would know? Because I think one of the things you talked about was big science with communications and collaboration, and there's so much geosensing, telecommunications, all the GPS satellites, stuff that, when you call up an Uber, you don't realize, which just wouldn't be possible with all the commercial space infrastructure that's been going on, not necessarily behind the scenes, but definitely put behind, I think, a lot of the end products people use, right? So, what does it take to get something like Sirium XM radio? That's something you just comes with your new car and you don't think about it, or GPS satellites that make Google Maps work.
Yeah, I think Sirius and XM is an interesting case because those were two companies that set out to broadcast radio signals from space so that they could have a much larger footprint. In the end, those two companies merged so that they could provide kind of a synergistic structure that would allow the overall company to succeed. And, even with the formation of NASA, I think the emphasis has always been on what are the commercial applications of the space business. Clearly, there are defense reasons for being in space, but you'd like to think that there are commercial applications, and people have really been working this for a number of for decades, since the beginning of the space program. And AT&T was very successful with the first intercontinental satellite link, such that you could beam signals across the country and around the globe. So communication satellites have been an obvious boom, and not just for telephone signals and radio signals, but then also for television broadcasts and uplinks and downlinks. In the last 50 years, we've seen all the technology develop that allows you to support the commercial industries. Most recently, I would say since the formation of Planet Labs, we've seen technologies associated with the cell phone industry. The commoditization, the commoditization of payloads, but also the economies of scale associated with the semiconductor industry.
What's Planet Labs?
Planet Labs is a group that started out of NASA Ames, focused on small satellite technology, and what they wanted to do was build a 200 plus constellation of satellites that could take a snapshot of the Earth on a daily basis. If you look at traditional satellite imaging capabilities, say 10 years ago, you'd say, hey, I want to get an image of a region. It would have to be scheduled. It would eventually, happen, whether it was good weather or not. The picture would be taken, and you'd end up getting a package in the mail that says here's your data, and that took a process of weeks. And then what was the ready access to that? And Planet thought, given the small satellite technology and imaging technology, that we should be able to bang out about essentially 200 identical satellites that could cover the globe and take a snapshot of the Earth on a daily basis. We've never had the capability to take a global snapshot of the planet on a daily basis. Of course, there will be those things you're like, oh, I know. There are things I know I want to look at. I want to look at the shipment of oil and coal around the globe. I want to see cargoes getting loaded up. I want to see oil being deposited in reservoirs. And I also want to see, parking lots, how much traffic do we see during the day, those sorts of things. But I suspect that there's probably a bunch of discovery science that you just didn't expect to see. Because anytime you look
Right.
at anything in a new way, you start to see things that you didn't expect, just because human imagination can only do so much, and you're always surprised by what you find in nature. And so Planet gives you an opportunity to look for those things. And Planet was one of the first companies to take small satellite technology and scale it up. And since then, there have been a number of companies we've seen over the last 10 years that are focused on Earth's observations. And it's like, I want to see what things looked like yesterday. Well, there's an archive that you can log into and download that section of the globe that you want to look at. People are focused on not just observations in the optical, but also in the infrared. And then using sophisticated technologies like synthetic aperture radar that is allowed to give you is a technique to look underneath the foliage of jungles, perhaps some portion of ground penetrating radar. And today companies like Spire are looking to interpret what they call GPS occultation signals, which is the GPS signals that we're talking about transit through the atmosphere. The signal is somewhat distorted by the Earth's atmosphere and the effects of the atmosphere, both temperature and humidity, and you can interpret that to kind of have an additional input into weather models.
That's pretty cool.
So, and there's a lot of new ideas. I mean, when you start doing stuff, all of a sudden you start coming up with new ideas about how to use that technology. And I think that's where we are right now, is people are still saying, well, how could we use the small satellites, the LEO environment, to provide better measurements of the planet, a better idea of what's happening on our planet, and keeping an eye on things. And this is technology that's been available through the defense industry for decades, literally decades since the Cold War. But now it's perhaps finding a home within commercial sectors.
So this is the thing I'm trying to understand, which is, it seems like you said, with the defense industry, these technologies, although some of them have gotten smaller and better and cheaper because of terrestrial innovation like cell phones, and innovations on the ground have really helped innovation in space. But there seems to be a pretty healthy economy of commercial companies doing sustainable businesses, launching satellites for a long time. What's changed?
It's probably economies of scale that people will say, well, is there renewed enthusiasm for space in Silicon Valley? No, that's not the case, because Silicon Valley investors haven't changed. Silicon Valley investors are looking for a standard model that they've used, since the 80s, since venture capital community began, that said, I want to put $100 million to work and create $1 billion company out of that, and do it with various tranches of funding. And so entrepreneurs, there are those entrepreneurs that are, mere mortal entrepreneurs, Planet, Spire, Capella, companies where you've got good technologies and you're building a company based on that. And you can retire risk and demonstrate success with tranches of funding that are measured in millions of dollars. Through the rideshare program with small satellites, you could buy space on an existing launch and deploy your small satellites as a much larger payload was being deployed simultaneously. These days, the number of small payloads has grown such that companies like Spaceflight Industries can buy an entire ride from SpaceX and deploy a whole host of satellites that are built not only here in the U.S. but also elsewhere around the globe. So it's a global movement. But with regard to the business model, it doesn't take hundreds of millions of dollars to build a space company. You can build it gradually, and you can build it gradually, much like you build any other Silicon Valley startup, with tranches of a few $1 million and then tens of millions of dollars, and then go from there. As you go through seed and Series A and Series B and so forth.
So companies like, I think there's this cadre of people and projects that have really captured the public imagination. definitely with Virgin Galactic and the space tourism aspect of things, that's still plodding along, and it's accelerated in the last couple of years. But why do you think this captures the imagination of people all over the world? And you mentioned you don't really think that's changed that much. You think that's been pretty stable. Why do you say that? You
Yeah.
don't think it's you
Well,
don't think it's
I mean, I think
growing?
people's enthusiasm for space has remained constant. Um, you know, and many of the entrepreneurs that you see in the new space sector, have always had some enthusiasm for making space uh, work for them. I mean, when you look at it's hard to imagine it's easy to imagine what the surface of Mars looks like, but NASA missions to Mars have really put a firm understanding of what that environment is. And the New Horizons mission out to Pluto. I mean, I hope that there's a greater awareness of the Earth's role, Earth's place within our solar system. Some of it is a bit abstract, as I think everybody knows that the Earth orbits the sun, and it's not that the sun orbits the Earth, but
You'd think so. You'd like to think so. I could probably point you to some groups online that are still really serious about the opposite.
There's always the Flat Earth
Earthers.
Society, but I kind of feel that the Flat Earth Society is really just trying to get a rise out of everybody, and I think what's different about the 21st century than the 20th century is that in the 20th century, space was merely a spectator sport for most people. You sat on the couch, you watched, what was NASA's latest manned mission, shuttle missions or the ISS operations today. And you're like, well, how can I get involved in this? Do I want to join a big company and push paper? And I think the role of small satellites has said, hey, for a relatively different price point, a price point that's consistent with Silicon Valley startups, you can build and fly hardware in space. NASA's tune has also changed, where they're not like, we're trying to Coca-Cola or Pepsi building a soda fountain in space. Let's work with companies like Made in Space, an early stage company that was focused on doing additive manufacturing in low Earth orbit. And today there are several other companies that are working to do additive manufacturing. And I think NASA has embraced the opportunities of entrepreneurs, has created opportunities for entrepreneurs to work on places like the International Space Station. They see it as their mandate that not just big defense companies can have access to the ISS, but how can we open this up to a broader, let's say, supply chain and nurture that either through funded space flights or a certain segment of astronaut time to do that. And let's open this up and see if we can get more innovation in that sector.
How is people or agencies like NASA and the ESA, how have they handled this transition? Because I can imagine that these are professionals, experts who kind of put their stamp on space flight and innovation, engineering, and physics. Was this a welcome collaboration, or was this a rocky start when they started seeing all these people popping up with, like you said, $10 million, $100 million tranches of money trying to get to space? Were they, what kind of role did they initially play? What was the reaction, and that changed over the years?
With established companies, they always like to create a barrier to entry, right? A barrier to entry means that, if you're a fan of Michael Porter and the Harvard School of Business, there's Porter's book on competition, and competition can come from many places, but what you'd like to do is you'd like to build a barrier to entry to keep your competitors out. And that works for a while, but the overall health of the U.S. economy, you can build border walls around the country and keep out good ideas, but eventually those good ideas are going to come back through some other channel. And unless you're innovating, this is sort of an act of creative destruction, you're probably going to lose out in the long term. And if you look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average, right, the number of companies that have been there, the average, the index exists, and they're constantly changing, but the mix of companies that make the Dow Jones Industrial Average change over a factor of over time. So NASA needs to do the same thing. They need to allow innovation in this sector, and I think they've seen that. SpaceX is the poster child for innovation in aerospace. If you look at the amount of money that's flowed into SpaceX, it's on the order of a couple of $2 billion. I think they just did a $2 billion funding round. But if you look at the top, I want to say the top 10 defense companies and how much they pay out in dividends per year, those companies pay out, over about $8 billion in dividends. Yeah, I mean, space is still a small player when it comes to venture capital. It's not like it's laying down buku amounts of money. SpaceX and OneWeb have kind of dominated the investment space for new space sector. But for established companies, these companies pay out a good chunk of change in dividends. And as Warren Buffett says, you pay dividends when you can't figure out what else to do with the company. So, what else to do with the money. And so for SpaceX to come out and invest an entire field of the aerospace industry with a reusable launch vehicle that many people thought, hey, that's not going to be possible. But,
So
hats off.
can we dissect that a little bit? Why, because I have a lot of questions about SpaceX, not just because what they've been able to do, but how do they do it? And how have they brought the public along in such a way where, their SpaceX launches are almost like rock concerts, right? I mean, you don't typically see this when the next I can't remember the last communication satellite that was launched, right, that had countdowns on TV and stuff. So there seems to be several aspects to their success. One is, their financial success, their engineering success, but how are they able to capture people's imaginations?
Well, I think by doing, certainly for Elon Musk as an entrepreneur, to say, be fixed in his view as to this is what's going to be possible, and fundamentally by working like hell. I mean, SpaceX is able to pull down the top few percent of all the engineering school, all the graduates out of the engineering schools, and combine both, old school space people with a whole bunch of young enthusiastic engineers that want to go out and change the industry. And there are many people that work for SpaceX that work for SpaceX for a couple of years and say, well, thank you very much. I think I'd rather go do something else, because it's, make no bones about it, it's a frickin' pressure cooker over at SpaceX. It's if you've been a part of a NASA mission, that those things are pressure cookers in and of themselves.
What do you mean? No,
just in terms of the number of hours that people put in. People will say, hey, there's supposed to be a work-life balance or something like that. And the truth is there are 24 hours in a day, and you got to make the most of your time while working. There are plenty of NASA engineer stories where they're working on a program and their family life's gone to quote hell in a handbasket because they're working all the time. So how not being part of the SpaceX family here, I can imagine it's the same pressures. And if you're a young person that's not building your family, you don't have as many demands at home, and you can dedicate your time to working to build out the space industry. So, and the other part about that is a reluctance, and again, Michael Porter, talks about the innovator's dilemma. And what happens is you have established companies that kind of are making a good profit, they're paying dividends, they're pretty much fat and happy. And what's the point of innovating? Why upset the apple cart? Kodak got out innovated by the whole digital camera industry. Where's Kodak today?
Yeah.
when you have innovation, if you're not embracing innovation, you may end up just as a story in the history books. And so the aerospace sector it's not just what's been proven, but the industry itself excels. I mean, the industry itself survives on using what's flown previously.
And that's
They're reluctant to adopt innovation.
Well, that's one thing I want to talk to you about, because one aspect of spaceflight is just getting things up there. I think no one's going to argue with the fact that we need communication satellites, geosensing satellites, we want internet. That story is one that's easily accepted. But it's we get it. I think everyone gets it. It's, you pull out your cell phone, use Google Maps, yeah, I'm using space right now, and I like it. It's an important thing to invest in, either from a government standpoint or from a commercial standpoint. But why is it so damn hard to get stuff up there? I mean, if you just look at and I'm looking at this from, you get something into the 200-mile orbit. 200 miles is a 3-hour drive, right?
Sure.
It's not that long.
Sure, but that's because you're moving along the surface of the Earth. You're moving across a equal potential surface. You're not really doing a lot of work. Anyone that's got plans at the beginning of the year for working out and going to the gym knows that working out is a lot of work. And a lot of people don't finish their workout routines. They'll start in January, they'll kind of get through February, and then March will come by. I think I can take a break. And then by the time December rolls around, they're like, I had big plans about going to the gym. That's because you're taking those weights and you're lifting them up from the ground, up above your head repeatedly. You're doing a lot of work. So anybody that's got to have a failed exercise program knows that doing work is hard. And lifting anything out of orbit, lifting anything from the surface of the Earth up into orbit is the same kind of deal. You got to do a serious amount of work. The other part about this is that you can go to the airport, right? You go to your local, whatever, whether it's Chicago O'Hare or BWI or whatever, and watch the airplanes take off. Listen to a 747 roll down the runway and take off, and it's carrying hundreds of passengers over to some unknown destination. Then go down to Florida and watch one of the Falcon 9 launches, just a Falcon 9 launch by itself, and listen to that engine as it rips through the sky. And just the sound of it tells you that there's about a factor of 10 in the amount of work that those engines are doing to get it up to orbit. And that's just the Falcon 9. We're not even talking about the Falcon Heavy, which has got 3.
Have you been to one of these launches?
I was down in the last one I was probably in 2016. I was invited by my friend Richard David from NewSpace Global. He said, "Hey, we're going to have a SpaceX launch party down there." It was great down by the beach in Florida. It was an eye-opening experience because you can watch the launch on TV, but it's not the same being there. And what you find with SpaceX this year, SpaceX has done 24 launches in a year. Next year, they're going to be doing 50 plus is part of their schedule. And so that's pretty much every week. So one of the difficulties of going down to a launch is, say you go down to the shuttle and you're like, hey, it's going to happen this, and the launch was canceled. I think going forward here in 2020 and beyond, you can go down to Florida and you can check out a launch. And if you're down there for a week or 2 weeks, you're probably going to see a launch in 2021 and 2022. So while you're planning your family vacation, definitely see if you can schedule it with one of the SpaceX launches and just listen to the difference between a rocket launch and an airplane.
You've been in this business for a long time as a thought leader. Did being there in person, seeing it, feeling it, experiencing it, how did it change your view?
It's fundamentally a controlled explosion.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's all it is. I mean, you've got fuel, you've got oxidizer, you combine the two in the engine and the rocket engine, and through the miracle of combustion, you have a gigantic explosion, and your goal is to use that energy in a constructive fashion. There have been many, you can go through YouTube and you can see many of the uncontrolled disassembly of rockets. Some of which have been absolutely tragic, like the Challenger disaster. But fundamentally, technology is about controlling the forces of nature. Even the steam engine, you had the boiler pressure and all the technology, the locomotive that you may take for granted. There's an incredible amount of technology in order to harness that, in order to do the work necessary to move tons of cargo from point A to point B across the country. So in the 19th century, we had the development of the steam engine. In the 20th century, we had the development of the jet engine. And in the 21st century, you're seeing, continued development of the rocket engine.
But that's the thing that I'm actually curious about, because the argument about just fighting gravity makes a lot of sense. Obviously, the physics of that's just a difficult problem to solve. That's not going away anytime soon, right? Mm-hmm. But it's a weird with SpaceX, because you're sitting there watching their launches on YouTube, and the launch itself is impressive from a technical standpoint. What's really, really fun to watch is the return, right? The landing. Right. And that's just amazing, because how the heck did they do that? How do they do that? Right. Is that the real, not just the reusability of the turnaround, but is that the real pièce de résistance of SpaceX, their ability to land that thing back down?
Yeah, what makes SpaceX different from the other launch companies is that they'll have a first stage booster that they can reuse. The intent is that an individual booster would be used 100 times with routine maintenance every 10 flights. And today, there are a number of SpaceX Falcon 9 Block 5 boosters that have been used, close to half a dozen times. And nobody, as they'll say, nobody builds a 747, flies it across the ocean, and then disposes of the thing. What makes the aviation industry work is the reuse of aircraft. What's going to make the space industry work is the reuse of the launch vehicle. And SpaceX is focused not just on reuse of the first stage, but also capturing the fairing later on, which is another part of the program. And you look at the amount of fuel that's involved in a launch, it's only a couple of, $300,000 worth of fuel. The price for a launch, for Falcon 9 launch, is, probably on the ballpark of $60 million. If you can get the cost, revenue coming in from a launch is $60 million. If you get the cost of goods down to about $6 million, then that's a pretty big margin that you've got on the launch. You're basically, profiting, let's say, $50 million per launch if you can get all the other costs down, the reuse costs on this. But that's where SpaceX is headed, such that the Falcon 9 ends up being a cash cow for the company.
How much of this, though, is real innovation versus, there's no non-dramatic way that rockets fail, right? It's always theater, and hopefully no one gets hurt. But there's some part of me that says, wait, I've seen this before. All these companies are getting a lot of attention for doing something that was done in the 60s. It feels like that. But is that just a superficial observation versus an actual?
We've never, as we've never seen first stages that have come down and landed on their own. We've never seen pairs of boosters like from the Falcon Heavy that came down and simultaneously landed. And, when it first happened, everyone's like, wow, what was that? And today, it ends up being almost commonplace, but it certainly isn't. And, that's part of the SpaceX secret sauce, so to speak, about how to build and fly a booster. They've got their ocean-going vessels that serve as landing pads. That whole system works, and perhaps even with Starlink, the whole thing will work even better, providing continuous data link between the drone ship, the landing vehicle, and the mission operations center.
So if I'm an entrepreneur and I want to start a technology company of some sort, and I just need, part of my business needs my technology to be in low Earth orbit, I have options now, basically. I've got more options coming to get my stuff into space?
Virgin Orbit just had their first successful launch with their air launch system. Blue Origin also is getting into the business. So you've got the billionaires of the world, whether it's Bezos or Musk or Sir Richard Branson, working on launch capabilities.
Why is that?
And then you have other companies. Well, it's access to capital, even depending on who you are, right? I mean, with Jeff Bezos and the valuation of Amazon, I believe you can just sell some Amazon stock, fund the company by itself. With SpaceX, they've relied upon the groups like Peter Thiel and the Founders Fund and others, DFJ, Draper Fisher, Jurvetson, Steve Jurvetson's connections, to fund SpaceX, and with Virgin Galactic and Virgin Orbit. There was a time when the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund came in and helped Sir Richard Branson. So, the success of an entrepreneur depends upon your access to capital, and your access to capital can be a friends and family round from your college graduates, or it can be a friends and family round from those that exited off of your last great startup.
So and this brings the question of this balance between two motivations to get to space, and also I think it segues us into an interesting conversation about manned spaceflight or human spaceflight, right? Because what are the motivations here for Blue Origin stuff? Because part of it's the commercial aspect of there's a sustainable business model that exists, probably several, right? And I'm not sure what the timeline of those are, but it does seem like there's the old pilot adage, right? It's like, what's the name of the force that keeps planes in the air? And it's money, right? It's not lift, it's money. Right. And it just seems like each rocket's burning a lot of cash, even though you said about the fuel, but it's like how much of that burn is going toward what typically the government would have funded before in things like big science or exploration or just kind of blue sky thinking stuff. What's the sustainable business model of going to Mars and anywhere near the next 30 years? I mean,
even looking at NASA, I mean, what's the sustainable business model for NASA? Part of it's the Cold War. Part of it was the money that the government was putting into launch capabilities to deal with the threat of a Cold War and the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles. And I was talking to somebody and said, part of the manned spaceflight program was to make those vehicles reliable. If you had essentially a Redstone missile that was certified for human spaceflight, that meant it was ready. That meant it wasn't going to blow up on launch. That meant that you were absolutely sure. If you're flying people on them, you're flying the Gemini, the Mercury astronauts on a Mercury Redstone. That that there's trust that thing is actually going to work. And so that adds to kind of the deterrence formula that not only are you talking about missiles that have a payload delivery capability, but you're so sure of those missiles working that you can actually fly people on them.
I'm just thinking from the investor standpoint. It's like we know that some percentage of the money burn here that you're asking me to give you is obviously to create, to be a launch partner for all these entrepreneurs. But I realize, hey, you want to get to Mars and just go roam around because you think it's a great experience for community to have, which is a valid experience.
But going to Mars, I mean, that in itself has its own. There are a bunch of challenges that you need to face. Right, and in particular the radiation exposure, and plus once you get there, it's great to do flags and footprints on Mars that you've gotten there, and you're able to return samples back to Earth for analysis. But what's it going to take to set up a colony on Mars? I mean, I would say anybody that has an interest in going to space should spend some time working with what at one time was Antarctic Support Associates, all the group that works down at the South Pole. You want to know what long-term exposure is and conditions of duress. Go work down at the pole. You fly into the pole. You can work down there during the summer. It's nice. Actually, during the winter is when it gets to be really cold. Gets to
Really
be
cold in
minus 80,
Antarctica.
minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit, because there's an inversion layer down by the ice. So it's colder down at the ice than it is up above that.
Well, it seems like
You know,
undoubtedly space has always become a platform for innovation that can, I mean, the number of spin-off technologies and things we use, I have no doubt about that at all. I'm actually very much for that ability, just personally, to have that experience of, if those experiences of low Earth orbit, interplanetary travel are available, I'm really wondering how much and how close, am I? Because it's like right now I can pull up Amazon and watch The Expanse. I don't know if you've seen the show, but there's some part of that show that just really paints this picture of humans just traveling back and forth through different factions of the solar system.
Yeah, there's the economy is based on natural resources, and in this century, we've reached kind of a tipping point of the use of those natural resources and the, eco balance, ecosystem balance on the planet. If, we're going to continue to grow, because GDP is probably, closely linked to energy consumption, and, using energy efficiently or those kinds of things, but to continue to grow the economy of the planet, we've got to have a different way of doing this. And you might say that some of the natural resources we need for the continued growth of human civilization are within our solar system. The nice thing about our solar system are there are no indigenous people that can lay claim. We're the indigenous. Everyone on this planet is the indigenous person of the resources in our solar system. How we're able to take advantage of those is kind of TBD. And I would also go back to when you do things, you start to have new ideas. And nanotechnology was a time in the early 21st century where we were funding nanotech labs all around the country. Today we've got one microgravity lab, and that's the ISS. Nobody just says, hey, let's just build one nanotech lab, in the center of the country somewhere there, and everyone can submit proposals as to what the research will do. And then we'll have a bunch of laboratory scientists that review, that do that work for them.
Yeah.
Everyone knows that you got to go in the lab and do the work that's necessary in order to figure out how nature responds. We don't have that today. For microgravity research, and we need to have that. So we need to have more microgravity laboratories in low Earth orbit where scientists and graduate students and research scientists, commercial corporate research scientists get up there and figure out, what is the best way to use the microgravity environment for the development of technologies that benefit people of Earth.
I'm very aware of, Garner's hype cycle, right? And especially when it comes to things funded by venture capital. And there tends to be, especially in the space realm, a lot of futurists. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean more just there's a lot of people thinking big, right? And who have, like you said, have access to capital, a track record of ideas, and are willing to build teams, right? To pursue them. So, but it's hard to suss out exactly how close we are in these different projects, because I don't know where it's like people are talking about here we're going to do this versus we're actually with the technology we can get to. For example, so could we talk about things like, like the Bigelow hotels is one thing. That's been a concept that's been there for a while, yet, can you just give me an idea of when I'm looking at the race of technologies, where is everybody in terms of human spaceflight in orbit, going to the moon or going to Mars, asteroid mining? Like, where are all these? Is everything trudging along, or have something stalled, or what's the landscape look like?
I think human spaceflight is a tough nut to crack, because even the astronauts on the ISS, when they get up there, they're like, motion sickness, and then being in a microgravity environment, and your spine expands. And talking to one of the astronauts, and he's like, "Oh, I used to have a compression device that would push down on my head, so it would compress my spine, so I would sleep." There are probably a number of stories, within the astronaut pool that perhaps aren't circulated about how difficult it is to work in a microgravity environment for a long period of time. 6 months to a year, and those are the records that you have today. But like with all things, you're like, you got to figure out a way to make that work, and you figure out that way by doing it and inventing ways to solve those problems. I like to think that within the commercial spaceflight industry, if you look at the aviation industry in the 20th century, you could look at, I just was watching something a little while ago. I'm a big fan of Juan Trippe and the development of Pan Am.
Pan Am, yeah.
It's a great story.
Great story with him in charge, bad story with everyone else in charge.
Well, right, yeah, but that's just kind of you might say, what other companies do you know that are that fall under that mold? I mean, how's Apple doing these days now that Steve Jobs is no longer with us?
How do you think they're doing?
People are still buying Apple products. I have my Apple Watch that I use all the time as I go to the gym. But are they going to go the distance here? They seem to have locked in a number of customers that are wedded to their products, and who knows, maybe Apple will even come out with an automobile. They should be producing luxury automobiles, right? I mean, that even Tesla was talking about selling to Apple at some point.
I saw that. Yeah, I just know how the Apple car is going to be, right? It's like it's like, oh, you want the charger for that? Oh, that's another $5,000.
Yeah.
Jesus, doesn't it just come with some of this stuff? The ports won't work.
But I think you can look at the rise of aviation throughout the 20th century. Out of World War I, we had the barnstorming period, and biplanes, and you might say that the role of the Department of Defense in boosting the aviation industry and creating the commercial aviation industry that we had at the end of the 20th century. But there was number one was people's sense of safety when in flying in airplanes. And you might say that Charles Lindbergh and his flight across the Atlantic. Here's one guy who's flying in a single engine airplane and flies across the Atlantic. Probably changed people's mindset about what aviation safety looked like. And Pan Am defined what commercial aviation was going to look like, not only with Lindbergh's role with Juan Trippe in building Pan Am, but then the aircraft that were developed under Igor Sikorsky, and then including in new technologies like radio, in order to help with navigation and communications during the flight. Radio was not born. It was sort of simultaneous with the aviation industry, but it wasn't obvious how you're going to get a huge radio, like on a ship's radio, out of a steamship. How are you going to get all of that into a compact form factor that you could fly on an airplane? And today, you wouldn't think of aviation without radios, but that was an innovation that was pioneered by Pan Am. They said, this is how we're going to need radio beacons in order to navigate, and we're going to need radio in order to communicate with our pilots and figure out, what's going on and how we can be assistants.
The innovation landscape is, I think, just one of the great triumphs of. It's the answer to that. The question that always comes up, which is, why are we investing in space when there's always stuff at home? And that's it's like, no, it's clearly the right answer to invest in space, because you get everything else at home using space as a platform that lets you innovate and spin things out.
Well, you might, I think people might say, why are we spending taxpayers' money on space? And you might say, well, why are we spending taxpayers' money on a lot of things? And what are we? And I would say, what is the ROI associated with the monies that we're spending? What's the, and any topic, not to turn this into a political diatribe on things, but investors are focused on ROI. Taxpayers should be focused on ROI too. What are you getting for your money out of all the things that the government's spending on? It's clearly, we all benefit from having good roads. We all benefit from having stable utilities infrastructure. We all benefit from laws that protect intellectual property and the rule of law throughout the country.
This is the $1 trillion question, is how you measure value. So it's difficult because, it's I would for me personally, like look at the Hubble Space Telescope. How do you measure the ROI on being able to capture the imagination of science and technology to a billion people, right? For the price of a Starbucks coffee in the morning or something, is whatever it costs to do that. That to me is well worth the effort of just in terms of the science, and the science is worth the effort, right? So I think it's difficult to measure some of the intangibles, and that's why I brought up the SpaceX thing, because you're right, because when those two boosters came down, you just like, you go to the web, you're like, how do you apply to work for this company, right? Like, it's like your next thought. It's like, I want to be, whatever those people are doing, I want to be part of it, because they're just doing something cool, right? They're doing something unique. What about commercial space habitats? I mean, why does the ISS have the monopoly on that right now, and why is that a government project?
Well, I think that's people in space is a hard problem, just like people in aviation, right? I mean, you've got to build vehicles that are safe. You've got to understand the safety concerns, and then it's a big cost to design and fly and build in low Earth orbit. The one thing you might say, ROI for the International Space Station. ROI for the International Space Station is, what does it take to build something in low Earth orbit? We build many things on the ground, but what does it take to build things in low Earth orbit? And that's what the ISS has really demonstrated and accomplished. That all those individual modules, they were built on the ground, but they were launched separately and assembled in space. It's pretty clear that you've got to be able to, you can't launch everything you need from the ground. You've got to be able to launch it and assemble it in space in order for, to envision, create some vision of the future. And that's probably what we've learned on the International Space Station. And not only build it, but then also maintain it. What does maintenance look like? What are the things that are going to come get you later on? And I think we've got a pretty good track record for understanding what life is like on the International Space Station, rather than it being taxpayer funded initiatives. Perhaps Space Station 2.0 is now investor funded initiatives. He's sort of done enough to, quote, retire the risk, and you can see where are the opportunities that are in low Earth orbit, and can you go build those additional modules to the International Space Station. I mean, I believe that the existing space station will, it's debatable how much of it's going to stay in orbit, but you're probably going to expand. Smart money is on decommissioning modules and then expanding them on the International Space Station. You've got a foothold, you've got some real estate in space. Can you, the Bigelow module is now there. They've kind of done an experiment on that. Can you decommission that and free up one of the ports? Are there other ports that people would want to use? Are there modules in the International Space Station that countries no longer need and say want to dispose of? Can we figure out a way to refurbish the space station, or does it require completely new infrastructure? Can we get there incrementally from the first, colonial outposts in the New World? How can you expand from those outposts?
So Sean, you bring up a really interesting question here. So decommissioning those modules, I mean, is there a short term, I'm saying 10 years or something, where I just, Ravi Co. wants his module on there, and I'm a private company, and is there an existing mechanism where I can go to NASA and apply to have a spot to hook onto? I mean, in other words, does it end up being a public dock?
I think that's still something that the NASA guys are working out. There are a couple of companies, NanoRacks is one of them, Axion is another, and NASA had recently done a study that included a number of established defense contractors and some of these new early stage companies. Blue Origin participated in that. So I think that's something that NASA itself is working through internally, of what is the long-term play for the International Space Station. In some sense, they're kind of behind the curve because, we're looking at 2020 today. This probably should have been a discussion we were having in 2020 and I'm sorry, in 2000, given the rate of change of things. And we are coming up to the engineering lifetime of the ISS. So there are probably a number of internal engineering issues that, those people that are outside the immediate circle aren't privy to at this time. But, something like what we saw of just, deorbiting the ISS is completely the wrong answer, in my opinion.
Is that being thrown around as
that's people are, it was thrown around and, under the Bush administration, where they're like, oh, we're just going to decommission the ISS, and nobody in their right mind. It's like you spent $100 million building the right ISS, and now you're going to decommission it. That makes no sense whatsoever in terms of taxpayer ROI.
And is that another, I guess, I would say commercial space advantage where you have some layer of political protection from fickle political enthusiasm, depending on who's in charge at in one moment?
Well, I'm not sure what you.
Government spending.
There's always a role for Washington to play. In whatever is happening. I mean, Washington will play, in the registration of frequencies for the cell phone industry, right? As the arbiter of natural resources and how natural resources should be allocated, such that people don't bid on them and then sit on them without using them. I think the mindset in the United States historically is that if you have a resource, it should be put to commercial use. There's a reluctance to have a resource and just sort of let it sit there. We see the benefit of that for things like the national park system. Anyone that's going to Yosemite is glad that Yosemite is sort of preserved out here in California, preserved in its original state with Half Dome and natural forest that's around it. We'd not like it to be a gigantic logging camp. Mm-hmm. So, but on the other hand, the national forest system is about how can we use the trees that are here in California, to the economic benefit of the community. So, I think space is the same way. How can we meter out this rather limited resource such that it's in the best interests of it serves the commercial potential.
So speaking of that, I'm aware in 2015 of legislation that basically I think the Obama administration had shepherded along that had allowed for rights to resources, right, in outer space, that were allotted to whoever had the ability to go and get them. So it was like kind of stake your claim in space and space resources, and those were yours. Is that protection, which I'm assuming is being extended to things like asteroid mining and things like that? That legislation, are we seeing just the beginning of future fights that are going to happen? And again, on this landscape, asteroid mining is one of these things where it's just on it's like fusion. It's going to come at some point, it's 20 years away. Where are we with how we regulate this area? Because everyone keeps saying it's the next $1 trillion industry, and there's a legal side of that, but also the logistics engineering side to that.
I would defer to the Space Lawyer podcast that you're going to do in the future here on this. But from my non-legal perspective, there's a difference between what happens in Europe and what happens in the United States. That I think Europeans tend to formulate regulations prior to there actually being a problem on that, and saying, let's imagine what might come up, and therefore let's put regulations in place, and that can be an impediment to the development of industry. In the United States, it can be that regulations are reactionary. Upton Sinclair and the Jungle talked about the meatpacking industry, and when things got really out of hand, then the federal government comes in and says, okay, people don't think the meat's safe. After reading Upton Sinclair's book, we better do something about this. We better put some regulations in place so that these people now have confidence.
The Ralph Nader, Upton Sinclair phenomenon.
Yeah, we better have people need to have confidence. And likewise, we were talking about aviation. I think Charles Lindbergh's flight kind of gave people confidence that it's safe. It's perhaps marginally safe to fly in an airplane. So
I honestly think that, dude, I think that was a fluke, man. I seriously think that was a fluke. If you read,
no.
Antoine Saint-Exupéry's books, his memoirs about flying, it's like those guys went down all the time, right? I mean, I think.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. It was tough, but Charles Lindbergh, he had his own plane, and he was the man in charge. And he's like, here's how we're going to do this. He had his own mindset about what it take to safely fly across the Atlantic, and of course, it took an all-nighter. And a lot of people thought, why would a pilot, go through 33 hours of flying? Can it actually happen? But, he muscled on through, much like, Musk is sleeping on the floor over at Tesla to make that work. It's that kind of dedication. So, I think there are differences between regulations in Europe and regulations in the United States. And, the U.S. regulations are perhaps reactionary. And that said, there are things like the Outer Space Treaty that people have to adhere to. It would be interesting to hear from someone to talk about what regulations we have on Mars, because I think the regulations for, the Outer Space Treaty speaks to, what you can do when you land on the moon, right? And so because that was in the immediate future, at the time they were formulating the Outer Space Treaty, I don't think there are similar regulations about colonization and operation on Mars. And you might say there's sort of I want to say gentleman's handshake on contamination of the planet. But as you go to Mars, this is a celestial body that has been quote unmolested by man, any sort of species from the planet Earth. And now, are you going to accidentally introduce microbes to the surface and contaminate the biological history of the planet, if there is any?
You say that. It's really funny that you say that, because some of the tenets behind the current theories of panspermia, right? It's funny how much interplanetary exchange there already is, just from asteroid impacts, bolides hitting the ground really quickly, really fast, and there's fragments that can reach escape velocity and eventually get captured, by Earth and so on and so forth. So that's one of the big, for me, from a scientific standpoint, just out of curiosity, I'm very interested in seeing what's on the subsurface. What's that subsurface structure look like, right? To a depth that we haven't been able to get to yet, like 10, 20, 30 feet, something like that.
Well, there's sort of Fermi's paradox, which is, if there is life in the universe, how come we haven't heard from it? I would say a subset of that is the paradox is, if there's life on Earth, what's the history of life on other bodies in our solar system? What's the, because you're looking at a 4 billion year history, of which the first, let's say, 500 million years is relatively poorly understood. And Harrison Schmitt has a nice discussion about the history, the geological history of the Earth, and what history has been wiped out by planetary activities. And some of that history is captured in the moon. I forget what the detail of that is, but it's basically the first billion years of the solar system. So, and our solar system is about 4.5 billion years. So something like 20% of it, you really don't have a good. You've got theories, but as you look to these other bodies of the solar system, you want to understand what is their history, right? What's the history of Jupiter and Saturn? When did they form, and where were they when they formed? And then what's the history of life on these other bodies? To me, the paradox is, why don't we find any signs of life elsewhere in the solar system? That's what you need. That's what you need to look for.
I personally think there probably is a lot of it. But because Fermi's paradox was always. You're a good physicist, so you'll probably agree with the fact that there's no real paradoxes in nature, right? There's obviously, we're missing pieces of the puzzle. We don't really understand it, but I think one thing about Fermi's paradox is that it refers to that part of the Drake equation that probably is the most important part, right? Which is like, well, what's basically the lifespan of any intelligent civilization enough to be able to create a radio transmitter, right? And that who knows? That's just not clear. Of all the things that are probably more clear, in the Earth's history, what's amazing at all is that life started pretty quickly after the 4.5 billion years. I forget the exact number, but I think there's still some parts of Australia where there's just species that are just, that are representative of things that were, bacterial colonies that were living there in like these bacterial mats.
Right. I think that's another future podcast for your show. Aside from the space lawyers, is the known evolution of life here on Earth, and then what we can expect to see elsewhere. And I think by looking elsewhere throughout the solar system, we can start to put together those pieces of the early history of Earth, which are the keys to the formation of life on this planet. We don't have a lot of insight into that period, and we probably have to look elsewhere to see what we can learn about that very early phase of Earth's history and of the solar system's history. And
single-celled organisms that found anywhere outside of this planet would be one of the greatest monumental discoveries of ever, right? I mean, it'd give insight into our place in the universe.
Right. However, the astrobiologists that have been, the NASA Ames Astrobiology Institute, I think, has been running for about 20 years here. So there are a lot of scientists that are part of the Astrobiology Institute, and, work on saying, well, what is life? What are the signs of life? What are the characteristics of life? How can we observe the signs of life outside of the Earth, but then also for exoplanets? What would be some signatures of life? I mean, here on Earth, oxygen, for instance, is not a stable compound. Oxygen is produced by, the plants that we see, the rainforests, the conversion of carbon dioxide into oxygen. Oxygen wants to combine with everything. Anyone that's left, their grill out in the rain knows that anything wants to rust, and that's oxygen eating away at those reactive oxygen eating away at that metal, and so. Oxygen is a sign of a chemical system that's kind of, quote, out of balance. Likewise, what are some of the other signatures for life? Because if you look at exoplanets, use something like JWST to examine exoplanets and distant stellar systems. What are the things that give you an indication that life exists there? But I think as we explore our solar system, we need to look for what are the signatures of life elsewhere in our own solar system, because to me it's very puzzling that the only signature of life we see here is on our planet, which some people may say, well, that's by design, for instance, but rejecting in the hypothesis of intelligent design and saying there's actually got to be a natural phenomenon associated with it, because natural phenomenon always seem to win out.
They seem to win out, and also I think it's not so crazy of an idea to think that given enough time, molecules arrange themselves in certain patterns, right, where they move and act a certain way. But that's definitely one of the biggest questions for someone like me to try to explore an answer to, but also the motivation to actually spend time on Mars, because I mean just my personal thing, to me it looks like a barren part of Arizona, so basically Arizona. Well, it's like people who are like, hey, I want to go hang out on Mars. I'm like, go try hanging out in Arizona in the desert first in a dome. Try that for a couple of weeks and see how much.
I think Mars will probably tell you a lot about the very earliest, the earliest history of Earth. And, both with Venus and Mars, you can say, okay, well, what are the differences? Compare and contrast the three rocky planets of the inner solar system, and what has led to the proliferation of life here on Earth, and how can we ensure that that's the case going forward, not for the next decades, but for on the order of centuries, if not millennia.
So if something like a commercial, there's a commercial engine that really helps drive that science as well. And just returning to this asteroid mining things, I think it's such an interesting, it really pushes the envelope on space ability, right? How close is that?
Well, I think the 21st century space program is going to look somewhat different, because one of the large economies of scale that we have today is robotic technology. And that, we've seen technologies in medicine. certainly see robotic technologies in automobile assembly. We're starting to see robotic and AI for the. I don't know. I was in one of the local malls and we saw one of the robot sentries wandering around. Who are you? Who goes? I kept thinking of RoboCop, but as it's wandering around,
Omni-consumer products,
interrogating people. Yeah. So,
yeah.
But I think the role of robotic technologies is going to be a disruptor for manned spaceflight in the 21st century. And you're going to ask, what's the balance between human spaceflight and robotic vehicles? We have robotic vehicles operating on the surface of Mars today. What's the role of robots going forward as we continue to explore Mars? And what's the balance between human spaceflight and robotic technologies for both LEO, for the Moon, for Mars, and elsewhere?
So is the robotic aspect of 21st century space flight, is that what's personally exciting you the most? What to you is something you'd want to be involved in or spend more of your time with? What is really exciting to you?
I think that the fact that actually going to continue the exploration of Mars may have some early evidence for what the history of the solar system was during those first billion years, which is the rise of life. I think the most exciting issue for 21st century science is the discovery of life elsewhere, off of Earth, and what is the history of life. And part of that can come from an understanding of the formation of the solar system. If you look at all the exoplanets that are around, we've got thousands of examples of exoplanets. What we need is something like a factor of 100 more examples of planetary systems in our solar system in order to understand the history of planetary formation. And then we can put our solar system in the context of this history. Then from that, we know really nothing about the history of life. As you say, why is it that life kind of exploded on the scene here on Earth? And to me, a big question is, why don't we see life elsewhere within our solar system of any form, or even the archaeological, the fossilized remains of life, or something
the question
to speak to how life arose on Earth.
It's the multicellular life question for me, because I would be amazed but not shocked if we found Europa to be replete with unicellular organisms like bacteria. It would be a great discovery and a great find. It would tell us a lot about it would take our N of 1 and go, okay, maybe this is more typical of what planets have and how molecules arrange themselves in formations we call life. But it's the jump to this very complicated multicellular or a very complicated eukaryotic cell, not even multicellular, this eukaryotic cell. The machinery inside a eukaryotic cell is just vastly more complicated, not just a little bit, vastly more complicated than your average bacteria. Which is more complicated than a virus. So it's these, like you said, these jumps. What prompts these jumps for more complexity? What kind of selection pressures need to be there? That's what's not clear.
Peter Thiel has his book 0 to 1, which is talking about startups, right? And I think you've kind of captured that, is going from 0 to 1, right? How can you go from like one example of something to many? And we have one example for life in the solar system, and a conundrum where if life is so resilient, if life is so plentiful, you expect to find life elsewhere. Why is it?
Yeah, well, the planetary story too is it's you think that the story of selection, of evolution by natural selection, is that the typical story is that living creatures and living organisms here have come to be in response to the selection pressures of the environment here. But it's much more interesting than that, right? Because I mean, Earth is in a lot of ways geoengineered by life itself. You mentioned one of the the oxygen levels is a great example of that, right? I mean, our atmosphere is engineered by organisms in the same way that what fascinates me on the astrobiologic front is where you find bacteria is just insane, right? Nuclear reactor pools, in clouds and water droplets, and who knows how much bacteria is present in water in the Earth's crust. A lot of it based from just oil wells and things like that. So it just seems like not shocking to me to be able to find these things on Mars. What would be shocking is, getting a radio signal for. It's like even the very complicated life we have on Earth. I mean, everyone always talks about how dolphins are really smart. Yeah, they're smart, but they're not. No, I've never seen two of them go, let's just tie some seaweed together and create a net, right? I mean, it's not,
right.
It's the jump to intelligence, whether it was a fluke or not, is quite another huge leap. So it's really the science. Even though you have a very deep interest in the commercial aspect, to you, it's a vehicle to do great science too.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at all the wealth that will be created on these things, and the economic benefit, and whether that economic benefit is shared with everyone on the planet. I mean, that's all sort of TBD. But much like with the age of exploration and the age of discovery, we're expanding our understanding of the world that we live in, and provide a better context for what's happened in the past, and what may happen in the future. It's phenomenal that we have robotic vehicles operating on Mars. It's phenomenal that we've sent spacecraft the outer reaches of the solar system, and it's phenomenal that we've got examples of planetary systems today that we didn't have 20 years ago. So technology is always going to continue to move forward.
What would you tell somebody who is a young entrepreneur, or at least somebody who is just about to embark on that path? And what does the future look like for them? I mean, obviously very positive from the discussion we've had so far. What specific piece of advice would you would you tell yourself, or let's say, back when you were 23 or 22 and thinking, I really want to be part of the commercial space ecosystem. I've got an idea. What do I do? Where do I go? Who do I talk to? I don't have a network. I don't have access to capital. What do I do? What are the steps?
Yeah, I think for young people, it's and the young people I've worked with, one of the lessons I try and instill is have confidence in yourself. I usually have some high school students I'm working with. I'm like, hey, go call these people. Go talk to them. And they're like, I don't know anything about this. I'm like, well, do it anyway. Go build confidence in yourself to do things that are hard. By doing things where you didn't think you could do them, and you do them, you start to build confidence in yourself. Also, as you're talking about the future, it's good to have a plan for what you want to do. You need to spend some time and say, what are the things that are important for you? Whether it's, spend a lot of time at the office or spend a lot of time at home, work intentionally, have an intention in what your day is, since, for time immemorial, and certainly, under the guise of Benjamin Franklin, right? He's like, time is the stuff that time is the stuff of which life is made of. And so use your time wisely and be intentional on your actions, and you're intentional on your use of time. Because if you're intentional and you know what goals you have and you have confidence in yourself, so long as it doesn't violate rules of physics, you could probably do almost anything. And your goal is to first have confidence in yourself, and then have other people have confidence in you, and you get people have confidence in you by being true to your word, being careful about what you say yes to, and then being executing on those things. My nephew, for instance, was he's an Eagle Scout today, but there was a time where he's like, I don't know if I want to be an Eagle Scout. I'm like, well, you've already gone down that path, go finish it. Because I can tell you, not finishing stuff really eats at you over time. And so, once you start things, finish them, and then figure out where to next. But
I think
when it comes to entrepreneurs, your goal is to have other people have confidence in you, because that's whether it's your co-founders, your employees, or your investors. They want to know that you're firm of purpose.
It's interesting when I ask you a question about entrepreneurship, it always comes back down to personal values.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's what measures the test of time, because it's under stress that personal values become apparent, right? It's not when times are good, but it's when the hammer comes down. That's when you find out what people are really made of, and it's your personal values. And personal values are kind of habits, right? You can create those things, right? You're like, this is the person I want to be. And, I forget what the steps are, but there's kind of awareness, knowledge, habit, so forth. And, eventually it becomes ingrained that this is what you do. And I don't believe that there's, people are born a particular way. I think people create, it's Mr. Han out of Bruce Lee, where he's like, we are the, forged, and we're the souls that are forged in self-discipline, or something like that. I mean, Mr. Han said it better than I could ever say it, but, go back to Enter the Dragon, and you can see that, anybody that, people are made through their own determination. Yeah. I mean, you can have the deck stacked against you, but you can't keep someone down forever. They keep working on it. If every day is intentional, they're like, this is what I'm going to go do. And I mean, you can go back to, what Musk said, the space looks hard, and it's harder than it looks. I would say a lot of things look hard, and they're probably harder than it looks.
Yeah.
If you look at, Supreme Court justices, that looks hard, and it's probably harder than it looks. Or anybody that's, had the tiger by the tail. Having the tiger by the tail looks hard, and it's probably harder than it looks.
That's right. Sean, this has been a really very helpful overview of how to think about 21st century, not just commercial space, but really what space can do for people, and the opportunities within it. How can someone get a hold of you? How do we find out what you're up to and what you find is interesting moving forward?
I'd say you can always reach out to me on LinkedIn, and happy to accept connections. If you send me a brief message, it says not just connect, but send me a message as to why you'd like to connect. That will kind of get my attention. But you can always find me on LinkedIn as Sean Casey, and I probably have a much younger picture of me up there during my good-looking phase.
Okay.
So.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. And I'll put those links down in the description of this podcast so people can get a hold of you. And if there's anything that comes to mind that you ever want to talk about with us on the phone again, or anything that's really exciting, please reach out and let me know, because I'd love to have you on.
Sure.
So we can
Well, thank you very much, Ravi, for the opportunity to be part of the program here. And it's always good talking to you. Thank you. You've always you kind of given me an opportunity to talk, but I always enjoy talking to you as well, because I always have and always expect to learn a lot from what you have to say. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, buddy.